No? Okay, well, welcome to this esteemed panel for our Around the World series to go with the Genesis conference in 2020. I guess I've always felt we're in a global industry, and yet we do events as one nucleus and we explore opportunities, but maybe one of the biggest opportunities from the COVID space for us has been digital events, and we all got frustrated about what we could or couldn't do, but actually it opened up a whole load of opportunities to have these sorts of discussions, because often we meet people who face the same challenges, but they're facing them in a very different environment with a different toolbox to solve them and a different background of experience. So I'm delighted for this one, we'll be discussing around the world in technology transfer. And I think that's a matter that's close to the heart of most people who see great research and they want great products to translate to patient benefit. So I'm going to briefly introduce our panel, and then I'll be leaving it to Fiona Nicolson to moderate the discussion through. So I'm delighted on the panel. We have Romain Rolly from Marseille, who's a European patent attorney and manages tech transfer down there in France. We have Chris Loryman from San Diego, and Chris has been on, I guess, both sides of a tech transfer and business fence. I think you'll have an interesting perspective. We have Reynaldo Garcia, who's Professor of Molecular Biology and Biotechnology at University of the Philippines. And Ray, again, is someone I know for years has really had the insight to see how tech transfer should work and how we commercialize our innovation, and is now looking at that landscape in the Philippines. We have Maite Ibern from the Autonomous University of Barcelona, back here in Europe. Again, forging those links between industry and academia. We have Angela Miller from LifeArc, I think sitting there overseeing all sorts of things around mentoring and fellowships and funding from a LifeArc perspective. And I think just the journey of LifeArc has been interesting, which I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about. And I'm delighted it's to be moderated by one of our leading commercial solicitors in IP, in Fiona Nicolson, who's had a number of eminent deals under your belt and many positions, Fiona, not least in the Licensing Exec Society International Forum, helping others come together and learn how to do this. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Fiona, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. I just think, as you say, one of the byproducts of this virus situation is we're all here together discussing these really interesting topics. It'd be hard for us to do that otherwise. And we're just going to have a look at some of the topics. It'd be interesting to see if we're all facing the same challenges or different challenges and how we deal with the tech transfer issues that are happening today. So we've got a few questions to talk about. And our first question is a big question, and that's talking about the current challenges that your organization faces at the moment. And I was going to ask Ray to start. For Ray, it's 1 in the morning, and we thought we'd give him pride of place to tell us how things are in the Philippines and what your experiences are at the moment of your institution and what you're feeling about the future. Ray.
Okay, thanks, Fiona, and hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, yeah, the challenges here in the Philippines are quite unique, I guess. I moved back to the Philippines in 2009. I used to work with Tony in the UK, and I was in the UK for 15 years. And that was the time when the Technology Transfer Act was just enacted in the Philippines. So you could see that things are quite late. And the universities didn't have their IP policy, and then the tech transfer offices had to be established, etc. And in terms of licensing, there were a few which happened in the past, but then when we reviewed how they were, the problems became apparent. So for instance, people didn't have any idea, for instance, on deal structures. So everything was theoretical for them. And what happened was that it was one-sided. The licenses were making lots of money, and then the governments and the universities were not getting their ROI. So it's a very big challenge in that sense, because I mean, coming from the UK especially, it was very difficult for me when I assumed the role as a tech transfer director of the University of the Philippines system. So we had to start from IP orientation. We had to tell people, for instance, about how to protect their IP, when is the right time to disclose their invention, and things like this. And then one big challenge, I guess, is who are the licensees? Because if you try to contextualize the case in the Philippines, a lot of research, very good research, is happening in the universities. But then in terms of having a proper biotech industry, there isn't any, because the landscape is dominated by generics companies. So in terms of licensing, going forward, we have to look at multinational partners, perhaps, which are into innovative drug discovery and development, or into diagnostics. But then it would take a while also to go into that, because people didn't have any experience. In terms of trying to commercialize intellectual property as well, that's another challenge, because there are no venture capitalists in the biotech space. The venture capitalists are in semiconductors and things like this. So you have an idea of what the challenges are.
Yeah.
It's quite enormous, but hopefully we'll get there in the next couple of years.
Yes, the knowledge and funding, the knowledge levels need to go up, and the funding level needs to be there. So I think funding is probably a universal type issue that people have. But Anji, perhaps you want to talk about the UK situation, what your perception is of the challenges at the moment, whether you share anything of the concerns that Ray has, or do you think the UK is in a different position?
I think a lot of the challenges that Ray is experiencing, the UK experienced that some time ago. So we're ahead in that respect. And technology transfer is recognized as a means of, really getting research to the patient so you can get impact. The issue, one of the main issues, I mean, there are many challenges that we still face in the UK, but the main one, I'd say, really, if I had to put something above everything else, is funding, because it is expensive. And then on top of that, the academic sector, the driver is publication, which there is always that balance. To get the balance right, do you publish, or do you delay it and actually protect the technology, which is required to take the technology forward? So, there are changes that are taking place with regards to recognition of research, so that translation and the long time that it takes for translation to take place is recognized, so that it's not less worthy because it's taking longer and you don't have as many publications. But it's one of the key things, the valley of death. Everyone talks about it, and it is something that is very difficult to bridge. But it depends on the technology type. For the life sciences and biotech, that's one of the issues. But I think also it's recognized that it goes part and parcel with research, and everyone now, if they're providing any funding, they want to see the outcomes, they want to see impact. So there is a push more for TT, but it is where funding is key, and also an understanding and appreciation of what's required to translate any research that you have.
Do you think there's been any funding, kind of new funding available in the last few years that's helped this area specifically?
There was, I mean, the thing is, previously, over the last 8 years, there's been a decline in some of the translational funding, but there has been new funding that's opened up. The problem is, these have to be big pots that can help, all types of technology. So it's very competitive. One of the good things is that there is more of a bridge between companies and academia. So there's better understanding, better collaborative working. So that sort of helped a bit. And then there's government funding where if you've started to set up and you've got, like, for example, Innovate UK, where you've got a spin out and it's there and you're working with someone else, you can get funding for that. There are quite a few initiatives, like LifeArc has a seed fund as well for new companies that have set up. So these are relatively new funding that's taking place. But the larger translational funding that existed before, say, for example, like the likes of Wellcome Trust, have stopped providing that, which was a key player in bridging that valley. There are new things coming up, but obviously with COVID that's happened within this year, obviously it's frozen a lot of things, and it has had huge impact on a very fragile economy anyway with regards to funding. But hopefully things will turn around. I think the problem is researchers are pushed to take technology further, which costs more. So if there isn't the funding, it makes it very difficult. So what do you do? Eventually, some of these technologies are just going to be published and out there rather than taking them along the path, the commercialization path.
Yes, thank you. So Roman, I think in France, you had mentioned in an email that you thought the Valley of Death is something you recognize. There's funding issues in France, is that right? Could you share Anji's view about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me well? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, absolutely. We have the same problem. The Valley of Death is not, well, it's real. And here in France, we have a TTO with special funding for trying to fill in the gap between academic world and industry. That's why, in addition to the classic and conventional attribution, that is to say dealing with IP, we also have some special funds to try to make the invention more appealing. For instance, for each project, we invest around 100,000 euros, up to 1 million euros for each ambitious project to try to fill in this gap. And usually when we do that, we try to have an industrial partner involved in this program. So usually we cannot sign license agreement because the technology is at a too early stage, of course, but we propose option agreements. And the thing is the following: we take the risk, we bear the risk. So if there is some technical failure in the program, we lose our money and the partner doesn't lose any money. But in case of success, the partner is obliged to exercise its option rights. So in a way, we try to secure our investment doing so. And we can invest quite lots, substantial, I'd say, substantial amount of money by limiting the risk. So of course, we need to a partner involved, and it's not even with this kind of means, it's sometimes difficult because in terms of maturity, we don't even have invention sometimes. I mean, it's just discovery, like discovering new targets. In terms of technology readiness level, it's about 1 or 2. So even with that case, it's quite difficult, to set up a program. So we have some helps from our shareholders, university, then can give some, small amount of money around, 30,000 euros just to make the proof of concept. And then we set to death, we try to set a more ambitious program. So let's say 4,000 euros, 400,000 euros to make this technology more appealing. And it works a little bit. Yeah, we doing so, we can fill in this this gap, this valley of death, like we say. Yeah, it's one of the solution, I think. Also, just to go back to the publish or perish thing, actually, it's a real problem. Yeah, it's clear that we don't have always the same objective, the same purpose. Researchers want to publish, and sometimes we need to wait before filing the patent, and it's quite frustrating, because sometimes you have huge discovery, like discovering a new target, and it's a lot of work has been done to do so. So you can have a very good paper, but on the other end, in terms of IP, intellectual property, it's just not even an invention, And sometimes we are quite frustrated. We try to make some proof of concept before the researcher publish their work, but sometimes it's just not possible,
Understand. So Chris, the perception we have about the US about funding is that probably won't be an issue for you. You've heard what everyone else has said about the funding issue in their countries with tech transfer, the valley of death issues. Perhaps you could tell us what the position is in your part of the world.
That's right. We are very lucky. I think the US continues to be the gold standard of tech transfer and moving technologies into the commercial space. In terms of funding, the valley of death is it's a known problem, and we have a known solution, particularly with the SBIR, or Small Business Innovative Research Program, which comes in a couple of stages or phases, which doesn't always help with life science research. And that does support a lot of our companies. And what we're seeing is that for the companies we start out of the University of California, San Diego, those that apply for SBIR funding, a majority get funded. We think about 55, 60%, which is excellent. And many of those go on to further money because investors like the non-dilutive nature of the SBIR funding. And so that's been a very successful program. And I think it's a game changer for a lot of businesses. The one downside is that it's slow. It can be 18 months or more before you get funding. I know the Innovate UK program, they seem to have turnaround times around 6 months, and that's absolutely superb. So, but yes, in terms of the wider environment here in San Diego, we're extremely...
Where does that money come from, Chris? Where does that money come from to fund that program? Is that money from the government or is that private money?
It's federal law that each agency must devote a part of its budget. I think it's 3%, don't quote me on that. A part of their budget needs to be devoted to fixing problems that they know they have through using companies who may have technological solutions to those questions. And of course, for UCSD, a lot of our technologies have been funded by the federal government. It was a known problem, whether it's cancer or some engineering problem. One of our professors comes up with an invention that may be a solution. That's very fundable from the point of view of the federal government, and it's a superb program.
Yeah. And what about the problem with publication too, the whole tension with publishing?
Not a problem, not a problem. We patent early and fast at UCSD. We are a public institution with a sadly very limited budget. And so what we do is look to patent early ahead of publication and try and get those into new companies and get the thing moving. They can raise money and go off into technical development. But we don't really see a problem with the patent versus publication. I will say we've probably built up expertise in how to draft our patent applications in a robust way early. I think that's a real skill, and it's just by volume that we've honed our skills in that area.
So, and do you have any challenges then? Everyone's talking about challenges. Just said you don't have a challenge with getting funding, the publishing, the patenting. So what would you, obviously we're trying to hear everybody in the question, but before we move on to Maite, any particular challenges at the moment that you have?
We do
first, I'm sorry.
So I was just going to say, could Chris just finish it? Do you have any challenges, Chris?
We do. We're a relatively small office. I know other places often have 50 or 75 people. We're down around 35, trying to process $1.5 billion of research per annum. We start 30 companies a year. We do about 150 licenses a year. That's a huge volume to deal with. Also, we've had some California government funding, which has been wonderful in the past to help with the innovation process for proof of concept funds. Sadly, that money's not available right now, and budget cuts may mean we're not going to see that money for a little while. And when we had that money, it did translate into proof of concept funding and new companies formed. They go out and raise more money. That's a huge win for our region. And that program may not be available for a little while.
Maite, sorry, let's hear from you. What are your concerns about your institution and moving things forward right now?
Yes. Well, first of all, I would say that maybe we are in the best period since the last decade in terms of investment, and we have our ecosystem in Catalonia is much more mature than before. So that includes TTOs as well. Scientists are aware of technology transfer or the benefits of technology transfer. So that's a good thing right now. But having said that, by contrast, we are seeing more and more a lack of research funding. I mean, in basic research. So it means that scientists are struggling to continue their research, even those who has been very well funded in the last years. So it is a real issue if we want to continue growing. And secondly, considering the huge amount of opportunities in science and tech that we have in Catalonia, the biggest challenge is how to fill the gap to reach the market with the limited and non-dilutive funding that we have at the moment coming from public sources. And last, that's true that some universities have already launched some proof of concept programs internally, but we need to obtain more public funding. That's a problem to continue to growing.
And what about publishing? Do you have a concern? Your academics concerned about publishing?
Not right now. It was in the past, but now we patent before, and then they can publish. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's very interesting to hear all your responses. Anything else? Any other challenges we've missed? I think we've talked about resources. We've talked about the money. We've talked about the publishing. I think, Romain, I'm interested in your comments, because you said the whole issue about publishing was that your technology sometimes it's just too early to patent, and therefore you've got a real struggle with the publishing. So I was wondering if anyone else who's spoken about that not being a problem has got a way to deal with that, because I understand that issue. You might have a paper ready, but it's too early to patent.
Yeah, well, in that case, we try to to patent sometimes something that doesn't exist at that time. I mean, when you discover some targets for a therapy, you try to make like patent target. You try to identify some drug that could be useful to address this target. And you try to consolidate your patent during the priority year. So that's what we do when we have this opportunity. But unfortunately, sometimes we are facing some problem wherein the paper is already published because researchers are not well aware of the patentability criteria still, even though we are trying to meet them, to explain them. Well, there is still some researcher that not well aware. So I think we need to be on the field to make them aware of how it works.
Yes. Yes.
And, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'd like to mention another challenge for me is the time. Because to me, according to our own study, it takes around 3 years and a half to make technology transfer from the invention disclosure to the licensing agreement. We try to reduce this time, but it's quite hard. For instance, from the CDA signature and the license, it takes around 10 months, almost 1 year. I would be interested to have feedback of the other people here, if it's still long for you. Do you have opportunities or solution to reduce, to shorten this time? Because it's quite, I know it's quite frustrating to make take so much time to try. What do you think about that?
If I may, I think we've been tracking this at UCSD, and certainly people forming a new startup biotech company, for example, that can be a lengthy process, and that's absolutely fine. Our median deal time around new company formation, I believe, is in the region of 3 or 4 months. So that's opening negotiations, closing negotiations, the license is done. We've tried very hard to streamline the process, what we call frictionless licensing, and it's been a great success. We've gone from 5 to 10 startups a year, 10 years ago, to now, 25 to 30 a year. And the key metric thereafter is, are they able to raise further funding, particularly from VCs, and we're seeing that that's happening. So it's some good feedback that the process is working.
Thanks, Kristen. That's interesting.
Great.
I think we'll maybe move on now to the second question, and we'll maybe come back to this topic again if we feel there's something else to discuss. So the second topic's about the role of pharma in relation to your institutions. Is it changing? What's the current situation? I think, Ray, you've already commented on the issue you have in the Philippines, that you haven't really got any large pharma companies. I think you mentioned that pretty much you're dealing with SMEs, is that right? Rather than large pharma in the Philippines. Hi, Ray.
Sorry, I was muted.
Oh, I think we're talking about the role of pharma, and is it changing? I think you had mentioned that the issue for you in the Philippines is you don't have many large pharma companies. You're dealing with SMEs, is that right?
Yes, in fact, there are no fully integrated pharmaceutical companies to speak of. I think I mentioned that it's dominated by generics companies.
Yes.
And there are only very few startup companies, biotech companies. But then in terms of possible partners, as early as now, we're actually looking at multinationals who could take on what's in the pipeline of these universities. So in that sense, it is a challenge. Although we have heard from some pharmaceutical companies. I couldn't, of course, mention the name. A multinational company is interested in injecting funds directly into the research groups in the universities for a kind of a first option to license whatever will come out of the drug discovery programs of the universities. So it's mostly trying to leverage the fact that the Philippines is one of the biodiversity hotspots. And we're at that stage wherein there are already some lead compounds that are we're trying to make sure that it's ripe for licensing, which is the problem of everyone else. But in terms of trying to have local partners, that's a big no-no. I think I also mentioned to you, Fiona, in our conversation that we're trying to pursue a dual path, unlike in first world countries, for instance, where you have drugs with identified active pharmaceutical ingredient. I think we're trying to follow the mixed model of Germany, wherein you have the herbal drugs. They don't necessarily try to separate the active pharmaceutical ingredients because it is the combination of the things that are there that actually works, but they do undergo clinical trials. So we have a dual path, and in that sense, the generics companies are interested because that is a shorter path by which they could come in. The problem, though, again, another problem is that they're quite risk averse. All they want to do is to come in when it's ready for manufacture. They don't want to take the risks with the universities in terms of getting involved in clinical trials. So a solution to that is that the government tries to provide the funding just to make sure that the promising candidates are brought to the latter phase of drug development.
Thank you. So that's very interesting what's happening in the Philippines. And you mentioned a multinational company coming to you. So obviously, one of the things that's interesting to look at is whether or not we think that tech transfer office can attract pharma companies from around the world, whether or not companies are looking for local universities to work with. So perhaps someone else could comment on that. Anji, what is your perception of the role of pharma in the UK?
I think certainly over the last 10 years, there's closer working of pharma with academia. There's better understanding. There's the issue always of the academic trusting a commercial partner. But with the decline of a lot of the R&D or reduction of a lot of the R&D departments in pharma, there is the need to work with academia because a lot of the research is being done there. But also the access to materials, medical schools with the access to close to patients. It means that, you know, there is real win-win on both sides. With pharma, they have a lot of calls for their needs for research into certain areas. So you'll have some of the large pharmas having certain portals saying the sort of technologies that they're interested in, and they will make mechanisms and ways where they can work, whether this is contract research or collaboration, or it's partial funding with some sort of arrangement, you know, to actually take the data and work together to develop it. So definitely there's better alignment, better working with the companies and the industries, for example, the universities that we're working with. And even when I was in technology transfer office, there wasn't an issue with regards to location. New technology and the fact that you can work remotely meant that there wasn't an issue. It was global. It was whichever company, and it is standard practice when you're marketing or trying to partner any sort of technology from a TTO point of view, that you would look globally. You wouldn't just necessarily look for someone local, because usually there's some way, and whether there's a branch or, you know, there's something there that you can easily work with. You don't need to have them, you know, basically in the same town or anything like that. So that's not really an issue with regards to geography. But it's just making sure that it's the right technology. Most companies now have academic liaison offices, so it's meeting the TTO function. It's almost meeting it halfway. So it's not just the TTO looking for a partner, it's also the company looking for the right academic partner as well.
And have you seen any change in the last few months? Do you think the virus has changed anything about the interaction between tech transfer offices and pharma companies?
Yeah, with obviously this year, a lot of the activity is being directed towards addressing COVID. And then the working academia and companies working together, and charities as well, because charities play a large part in the TT sector. Obviously, with charities, there's that patient interaction, and this is where it's really important that they play a part of it. But with the drive to address COVID, it means that there's greater alignment of all these sectors working together to really achieve the same aim, which is to tackle this and get this controlled. But it's unusual. It will change. Hopefully, it will change the way of working, and it will bring everything closerly aligned. But the question is, what will the new norm be like? What will the model be like? How will this affect it? But there is better working. It's seamless. I mean, a lot of the obstacles, there's not enough time to address those and to put those as get those in the way. It really is where everyone is working all hands on deck for the same aim. Yeah. So it's remarkable, the fact that this disaster, I mean, it's something that's unforeseen, and it's terrible, but in the way these industries are working together, these sectors are working together, it's fantastic.
Great, I agree. Romain, what about France? Are things happening in France and that the same as the UK, or are the experiences different of working with pharma, particularly in the last few months?
Well, in terms of licensing, the pharmaceutical companies are not our target. We don't work a lot in terms of pure licensing. I mean, not collaborative agreements. It's only maybe 2% of our licensing deals. So we think we have the impression that big pharmaceutical companies are here to make business intelligence, to watch what's going on in the lab, but don't want to be involved at a very early stage. It's often too risky for her. So usually we make deals with SME, and then pharmaceutical industries buy their SME back, And it's mostly how it works. Yeah. So we don't have so much pure licensing deals with pharmaceutical company. Also at SAT Sud-Est is something particular. We don't deals about collaborative agreements. It's directly deals by the university. So we are purely concerned, focused on the licensing. That's why we don't have so much deal with pharmaceutical company. Yeah.
Well, what about the US? What's the situation there with pharma and your interaction with pharma? Has that changed in the last few months, Chris?
Well, firstly, I find it fascinating, Romain's point about around 2% of the licensing activity is with pharma companies. That is exactly our experience as well. Under 3% of the licenses we do are with big pharma companies, and of those, 2/3 are research tools. And that's great. We publish, somebody wants a cell line, we'll charge a little fee to cover our costs, no problem. But in terms of the therapeutics, the big activities, big pharma's not present. We have a flow from the university, the academic space, into small companies that then flows into big companies like biotech companies, and then it moves into the big pharma. And there is a gap here and a need to have a conversation about this full life cycle, because Anji made a great point about how big pharma companies are key partners with academic labs. It's an important source of money. We greatly appreciate the sponsorship at the university. So there is this life cycle. And I would love to have big pharma companies stepping forward and having more of a conversation about their needs, but mindful that ultimately it's quite likely if we have a new patented technology, it might flow to a startup founded by the postdoc out of the lab. And then on, what should we be telling the postdoc? What do we need to be providing to the postdoc that helps that technology be attractive to the big biotech and the big pharma in the future?
Yeah. So Maite, what's your experience? Are you dealing with big pharma companies or SMEs? What's your experience?
Yes. Well, yes. So from my experience in the last 5 years, we have been very proactive, going to meet companies and being as much visible as possible to meet them. Even we had a regular presence in some ecosystems other than outside our ecosystem, because it was the only way to meet companies, pharma companies, big pharma companies, in order to get feedback and also to promote our projects covered by IP and also the specific or the unique capabilities or expertise of some of our scientists. And now we are seeing more and more conversations with pharma companies, and also we have signed some deal, but it's as you said, it's not a traditional license agreement. It's something more complex. So it's a combination, which is good. But yeah, it's good. There are good opportunities as well. But we had to do things differently. We had to go to the companies in our case. But now we have this network. Now in this COVID time, that helped us very much.
Must we see
because
that successful, that whole outreach is proving successful, that you've actually gone to them?
Yeah. But also we changed the way that we promote IP projects, because we decided also to promote unique expertise of our scientists, and that helps very much because with this information they find interesting the research of those people, and we start conversations more interesting, and also we get feedback, and also scientists, because scientists now they know very well the basics, and they need extra valuable information coming from pharma and also investors.
Yeah. Thank you. Anything else to add to this topic, or we move on to the next topic?
I agree with Maite. One thing is, and a lot of the time when people are talking about technology transfer, they're thinking of patents. And it's also know-how and the expertise of the academic. That is a real true attraction, because every university now has a department that deals with consultancy, and that's the commercialization of the know-how and expertise of their researchers. And it is where that is a way of actually having a close alignment with pharma, whether it be SMEs or large pharma, but it is also that leads to, a lot of the time, that leads to collaborative working as well, because it's really where would you find someone who has both their foot in the clinic and also research, and has everything there, and that's something that is really commercialized through consultancy departments now.
So staying with you, Anji, because I think it's the topic that is close to your heart. The role of the tech transfer office, is it all about making money, or is it a wider role?
No, it's and this is the battle that the TTO has had for forever. It's one of the key things that the TTO, as well as trying to really bring research further along so that it is impactful, and that's really impactful to society and patients. It is also the understanding that very few technologies make huge amounts. You hear, but these are the ones that you hear about, but it's really where, if someone feels that they should be looking at the pound signs from the commercialization of research each year, they're going to be very disappointed. You have to invest in there, but it shouldn't be, the outputs have to be metrics that are not just economic. They will have to be where they're looking at the non-economic metrics as well. And there's a big drive.
It's hard to mention. Is it hard to measure these metrics, though? The measurements for
yes,
count the money, but the wider.
This is the difficulty, because you're talking about a sector where it's driven by nature for publication, that's how an academic is known as being very successful and an expert and a leader in their field. But also they're working alongside, this technology transfer where you really need to hold on and not disclose so early, so to protect it. But the actual journey to actually have a technology, or whether it's a therapeutic, diagnostic, or any other type of technology, takes time and investment. And that patience means that it looks as though you're not doing anything really if you're using standard metrics of publications. So it's looking to find a balance with the metrics that are used are both recognize that it's translational research, so it's a longer time to actually mature and have output, but activity is being done there, and it won't necessarily lead to loads of money, but it will address, an unmet need.
Exactly. So Chris, I'm interested in San Diego. What are your metrics? How do you see them?
In terms of, this is such an important point. Firstly, in my job, I work as part of the University of California, and a role I have is not necessarily about making money, but it can be supporting economic growth and getting technologies out into the space. And I agree entirely that tech transfer shouldn't be about making money. A lot of offices, they can have a very successful year of operations, perhaps generate $1 million in profit. Well, a postdoc can turn around and apply for a grant and get $1 million. But when you look at the wider economic impact, what you're seeing is the companies are raising money, they're bringing lots of money, particularly international money, into their local environment. That's the big win. Also, for our faculty, when you've got a rich, active tech transfer community, the faculty discover new sources of money from those startup companies, but even more importantly, new sources of information, particularly in things like FDA-regulated drugs or so on. There'll be experiments that aren't done in the academic space. And so what we see is faculty hanging out in the faculty club, and they're chatting, and somebody's talking about something they don't know about, and somebody leans over and says, oh, no, I'm on the scientific advisory board of a biotech company, and we had a meeting with FDA, and they said, no, we definitely need these things. And there's such a richness to that flow of information. Money's secondary.
Yeah. What about France, Romain? What's the position in France? Is the wider benefits of tech transfer recognized, or is it all about money?
Yeah, sure. Well, the very first aim of a TTO, I think, it's to make sure that the end user, well, the patient actually benefit from the scientific advances. So the goal is to convert scientific advances into marketable and good and marketable of good and services, so to benefit and for the patient. But that being said, I have to admit that we have been asked to result in terms of money. So we are very focused also on the annual sales, and we monitor for each year how much money we win in the universities, the TTO, because secondary objectives of the technology transfer is also to add value for the university. So I agree, of course, with you with the primary objectives, but I have to confess that money is also important, to be able to justify our activities. Also, we monitor the job creation, which is not quite so easy to monitor because you don't really know exactly how much job you created. But this is also taken into account and have a great impact regarding politics, government, when you do your reporting about your activities.
Yeah. Maite, what's your experience? What's your view of tech transfer and what makes it a successful tech transfer office?
Yes, well, in our tech transfer, so the main objective is to facilitate the innovations or inventions goes to the society in a benefit for society. This is the main goal that we have at the moment. Of course, we will be happy to be metrics about economics or how many jobs we have created or so on. That's possibly the future, but at the moment we are more. The first objective is also to try to benefit society from the inventions coming from the university.
Ray, I think you said in the Philippines that it's early stages for you in this whole process. What are the expectations of the tech transfer office for you?
It's quite different actually. If you talk to the universities and the TTOs, they like talking about the MIT Kendall Square example, how it contributes to the economy. But then the government funding agencies have a big say in what the purpose of tech transfer is. And I think that is what we have been observing because as Anji said, it's about really how it impacts patients. And the needs in the Philippines are quite different because, for instance, things like dengue, you don't find them in most first world countries, leptospirosis, chikungunya, and we are seeing this. What happened was that there's a lot of funding poured into developing diagnostics for those diseases. And we were quite successful in coming up with a product. So the government really couldn't be bothered in terms of the universities making money. The fact is we were able to come up with the dengue diagnostic kit that is actually superior than what was actually out there in the market in terms of the window of opportunity to intervene within the first 48 hours. So things like those simple technologies, well, we had the advantage of having freedom to operate because the inventors didn't patent isothermal amplification here in the Philippines, but we were able to come up with quite a number of useful diagnostic kits that address local needs, specifically dengue, chikungunya, multiple drug resistance TB, leptospirosis, etc. So in that sense, we are counting them as successes, although it's not economic. They're looking at eventually through leveraging the biodiversity of the Philippines and coming up with what could be potentially first-in-class drugs. We're still aiming for that in the long term, but the immediate term fruits of technology transfer in diagnostics, I guess, specific to the local needs, because those types of diagnostic kits are not being developed by multinational companies. So we had to do it ourselves.
I get the impression there's quite a bit of government support. I mean, you've passed this legislation in the last few years. So in the Philippines, are we really seeing the government getting behind the success of tech transfer offices?
Yes, in fact, it is they're very hands-on in that sense. Perhaps because they realize that there are not many sources of funding. So they essentially provide, apart from the research grants, they have seed funds. It's called the Technicom grant, to make sure that those technologies which are quite ripe for being developed into a product, because they just provide the funding for that. So they don't really care, for instance, because essentially they're just a gift. Normally you just have one type of seed grant from the government, but here they have been funding everything all the way to productizing. And I think it's because we haven't really knocked at the doors of potential partners who may be interested in the things we develop, except that the kits are really, the needs are local. So we're not really hoping very much in terms of finding partners elsewhere. So the government is trying to step in.
Well, I think we've covered seed funding and some of the other questions, but is there any other comments that anyone would like to make about the availability of seed funds, or some examples perhaps that we could learn from, which have worked well?
Well, in the UK, there are almost every university has seed funding. The problem is, it's the amount of seed funding that they have for the technologies that are there. It's really where it's not enough, because you've got some technologies, again, we go back to life sciences and biotech, which are very expensive compared to, for example, an app or something else. So they have seed funding. The issue is access to it, so it can really, those who really need to have it, because a lot of the time you've got the technology transfer office that is funded by the government funding, and that's for basically higher education to actually ensure that there is impact from the research. But the running costs, and then also the costs for seed funds, proof of concept funding, it's very limited, and that's going to be a mix of government, other sources, for example, internally, or charity funding that comes in. With the seed funding, a lot of the time it is where now there are an increase of number of accelerators and incubators, which not only provide that additional funding that's required to get some of these technologies off the ground, but also the mentoring, the space, the office space, but also the support, the advice that's required, because it's resource intensive to take any technology from that early research stage to the point where, whether it's it can be spun out into a company, or anyone else would be interested in investing or licensing the technology.
My impression, Chris, is that in San Diego, you've been incubators, accelerators for quite a few years. Is that right? Dan's talking about these being developed in the UK more in universities.
That's right. That's right.
Something you know about, isn't it?
Yeah, we're very lucky here. We have a whole range of different kinds of incubators and accelerators. Very famous one, JLabs, but also biolabs and lab fellows and many others. And what is interesting is people have said, oh, somebody's doing a new accelerator or incubator, they're going to be cannibalizing. That's not true at all. What we've seen is the innovation economy locally expands to use those resources. And so that's very encouraging. But just to go back to Anji's comments, absolutely right about the funding. One thing I've been lobbying for really is funding to move technologies from the university space into a new company. Get a startup company, get it going, because then once they're started, they can go out and raise more money. And not all do. And in fact, if all of our companies are successes, we're not doing our jobs. We should be optimistic and enthusiastic about giving people a chance to go out there. And there is a need, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic for funding. Ideally, if I could choose, funding controlled by tech transfer offices, and they move the technology into a new company and get it underway and try and find some mentorship, because then that company can go out and raise more money. And it's a gap. It really is a gap.
Yeah.
So Maite, what about Spain? Or where are you with seed funds or support for startups?
Well, seed funds for startups at university, at TTO's university in Catalonia and Spain are quite rare, for sure. We have proof of concept funds, but not seed funding. For seed funding, we need to go to accelerators or mentoring program from venture capitalists. But yeah, so yeah, we would like to do it, but it's quite hard for us because 4 years ago, we started the first proof of concept fund, and we have been working on that for 10 years to get this proof of concept fund for in competition for our own projects. So then we need to fight for the seed funding. But what we are doing instead is that we don't want to create a company just for create a company. So we work together with the scientists. We decide with them which project is better to spin out, and then we work with them, and on top of that we test the market before. So it means that we engage in conversations with investors and sometimes pharma companies, clinicians, and patient associations before to decide if this project is interesting to work on that to spin out. So once we have this, so we work together with the scientists, and we try to build everything around to have a more solid package or valuable package to sell.
But as Anji said, that's very time consuming. It's very resource intensive to get to that point. So in France, Romain, what's the position in France for seed funds?
Well, we do have incubator, accelerators, but also seed funds coming from the government, which helps, of course, the creation of startups. We have something called La French Tech. So the French Tech have several means to do seed funds. One of the means is that the French Tech give an amount of money which is equal of funds that you could raise with investor. So it doubled if you want to double the money you have. So it's something to have the creation of startups. But I agree with what has been said, and I have no more comments. Yeah. Okay.
So time to deal with the other two questions very briefly. The first one was about academics becoming more commercially savvy, and I think you kind of hinted, some of you, about the involvement of academics in the commercial process. Anji, you're nodding. What's your perception of academics and where they want to be nowadays? Are they keener to be involved in the commercialization process themselves?
Yeah, they definitely are. I mean, the thing is, there's an increased awareness that this is the reason why you're a researcher. It's not just, you're just researching in the lab. It's really to impact. So it's changing where basic research, where you're just looking at, say, for example, a certain channel, why are you looking at that channel? How does it translate to whatever indication, and what does it mean for the patient? I think it's recognition and understanding the journey, but also there are initiatives to increase awareness of the path that's taken to get research, the research that you're undertaking all the way through. Who do you collaborate with? It's more, I mean, it's more common to find collaborative research taking place. So you'll have different disciplines working together. COVID is a prime example. COVID is also an example of where you've got researchers who specialize in a particular area actually moving over and just helping to deliver whatever's needed to be done. So I think there's greater awareness of that. There's the schemes, for example, to create the entrepreneurial scientists. In the US, it's more common that you'll find a very successful scientist who is a professor, but also an entrepreneur in a company, one foot in a company and everything else. It's becoming increasingly more common in the UK, but it's difficult because it's slightly different ecosystem. So I think that has helped where it's increased an understanding of what's required for technology transfer and appreciate why it's there.
I would agree with that from my experience. It's very interesting to see that development, particularly people working with each other across disciplines and everything. So Ray, in the Philippines, if you're still with us, given it's nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, what's the position in the Philippines regarding academics and involvement in the commercialization process?
Okay, things have changed quite a lot in the last 10 years that I've been back here in the Philippines, but I see still a couple of problems. It has to do with the finer points, I guess, of tech transfer in general. So for instance, I still notice that people still have to have a good grasp of what is ripe for licensing. So that bit, especially in the context, for instance, of drug discovery and development, is it ready, for instance, for a licensee to share the risks with you? So they don't have a grasp yet of that in general, in terms of what is already ready or ripe. And then the other thing is there's still the general attitude of being afraid of their IP being stolen by some people in academia. So they really want to have it published, and they really want to develop it themselves. So you try to tell them that it wouldn't happen that way, because drug discovery and development is a long and lengthy process. So you really have to license it out to a bigger partner at some point. So all those things. So sharing risks and sharing rewards, knowing when it is the right time to license, when you cannot yet stop, because otherwise it just becomes an academic exercise. So those are the remaining problems. And the third one I'll probably mention is, again, finer points about licensing. Not many people know yet about option to license. And because there have been case studies already wherein some big pharma companies are trying to get away with it, and they'll probably say that we want to try your portfolio of drug candidates to test them against cancer and pain, etc. And then they compensate the university very little for it. And that is because some people in tech transfer are not aware about things like option to license, that too, in theory, could fetch a lot of money. So, so that is one complication, plus the fact that sometimes those IPs are shared with another university in the US, for instance. So it complicates matters in terms of trying to negotiate things like options to license.
Yeah. So Maite, what's the position with you? What's your understanding about academics and what they want to achieve themselves these days?
Yes, well, in fact, they are more savvy and they want to commercialize or to be involved in a spin-out, for sure. As especially those who have been involved with us in our TTO for the last 10 years, and they grow up at the same time than us, and also our ecosystem. So they know very much the basics, and they want to grow up. But sometimes they are struggling with the requirements from pharma companies and VCs, because some of them, they have a scarcity of personal resources at the research time and the research team in the academia. So they find very hard to collaborate with them, even if they want. And also sometimes they feel that they don't get the feedback that they will wish to get from companies and also investors when they finally present the research project or the project to spin out, because they want much more valuable information that they don't get it. So sometimes I feel that maybe they grow, but the ecosystem or the sector continue being the same, or at least it behaves in the same way before the scientists. It's quite strange sometimes, but of course they want. And also in our ecosystem, all the players have built like a kind of environment with much more entrepreneurial, with a lot of mentoring, encouraging people to spin out companies. So that's the environment that we have right now at this moment.
So Chris, is the position in your university that you're encouraging academics to be entrepreneurial, as we're hearing from Maite, or do you have some academics who are still wanting to stay in the lab and not be associated with companies?
Well,
there's a mix, absolutely. If people aren't interested in commercialization and licensing, that's fine. We're not going to force anybody. But I think one significant finding we've had is that academics can find their academic experience enhanced through seeing their technologies licensed and commercialized. It does provide that new source of money, but also information that they would have no other way to access. And that is so valued by our investigators. But then equally, they can see that their innovations are going into companies that are part of the local economy, raising a lot of money. And now the university can say, look how well we're doing, look what we're giving back, all these jobs. And that's a direct connection between an academic and a lab. Normally they just think about publications, but they can point to the wider economy and the jobs and the inward investment. And that's a big deal, that's a big return, and that impact is what we're all here for.
Lorraine, what about France? How are you academics? What's their view about the commercialization world?
Well, you know, some of them are, well, still some of them are a little bit against patents, even though they're not opposed to technology transfers. They consider patent as like an evil thing, you know. So it's sometimes hard to explain that something that, yes, provides you the right to forbid someone to exploit your invention is actually a way to promote your inventions.
Yeah.
So we have to make them aware that patents are not bad thing, you know, but it's the contrary. It's something that helps. So technology transfer starts with the good IP. So we have to convince them that IP is important. So they are becoming more and more savvy, but unfortunately, some of them are destroying their patentability by publishing without being aware and conscious that it's a problem for novelty. So usually the researcher that works the best are the one who already tried to license or who are already interested in transferring the technology. So at first they have a failure, and then they become more and more aware of what to do, what are the good practices to put in place, and then we fortunately succeed sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good to succeed. So our last issue is about whether or not to spin out or to license. And would any of you like to comment on that last issue? You've got particular strong views on the spin out versus licensing in your organization, in your tech transfer office? Which is best? Or that's not.
There isn't, I don't think you can say which one is best. I think it depends on the technology.
Sure.
Generally, you know, it's really where if you have platform technology, so technology that can be applied in multiple ways, or it's a package, then that's more suited to a spin out rather than a license, but you could license it. And because licensing is, if you do it well and you understand and you have a really good strategy, you could, a piece of technology could be applied in so many different ways. It really depends on the market, the technology, but also if you have the buy-in from the inventors, because a lot of the time with some of these technologies, you need to have the inventors on board to some degree, whether it's not necessarily to be a CSO on a company, but there is a certain amount of know-how that needs to be applied. So you'd have to have the academic with you to a certain point. So I think that's one of the limitations. But the thing is, if there isn't someone to take if there isn't going to be someone to take the technology or to invest in it, then it's going to have to be a license. So it really is, there are so many factors that play a part that it's not necessarily just a straightforward, which one is better.
Chris, how do you decide whether to spin out or to license in San Diego?
Well, I certainly have very strong feelings about this. When you look at existing businesses, they have a business plan and their leadership don't want any distractions from that. And a new project, particularly an early stage technology, it's very far from commercial readiness, is not very attractive. And so the reality is, for most of our technologies, if we want it to get out into the universe and have impact, it has to be through a new company. That's just the reality. And Anji's right, you know, platform technologies or things with multiple utilities are good starting points for companies. But the reality is, most things I look at, if it's going to be picked up commercially, it's going to be through a new startup company, either by a postdoc or maybe somebody who's interested. That's just the reality. And so if somebody turns up and says, hey, we'd like to license something, fantastic, that's great. We do a lot of work with research tools and software programs. Super, our doors are open, come on in, we'll do a license, let's get it done quickly. But for those more complex technologies, it generally has to be a startup company.
Thank you. Any other views? Licensing, spin outs? Maite, what's your view in this area?
Yes, well, completely agree with Anji when she said about that to spin out a company, it's important that the scientific team was very collaborative and also understand very well what will be their role in a potential spin out. This is one of the key aspects that we consider when we decide that one project could be a spin out. And also we want to, as I said, we want to create or build everything around. So it means IP, but strong IP, plenty of data, enough room to generate new assets, know-how as well there, and also if it's possible, orphan drug designation, is it possible? It depends on the indication, everything around patient access as well. If we can start discussions with patients, associations, clinicians, in order to get as much information as possible and having them with us in the project as well. So that's very interesting because we don't want to spin out or to create a company without anything, and we want to find the investor before to create the company, because we did that in the past, that's creating the company, and we will see what happened if it doesn't work. So we have changed our mind in this aspect. So yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. Remember, what's your experience in France then? Are you involved in many spin-outs, or is it mostly licensing activities?
Well, you know, as a matter of fact, we only have 25% of our deals that are directed to startups, so it's not the majority. But we do create startup. I'm not sure that the best reason, but the reason is usually the willing of the researcher to create startup, you know, and we take this into account, of course. We are very careful and we pay attention to the team, you know. When the researcher is purely academic and want to be a CEO, it's a warning for us. I mean, it's possible, you know, but we want sometimes to see someone with a more commercial background than just a scientific. Yeah. Also, the technology, you know, it's not mandatory to have a breakthrough technology, but if the patent is weak, or if it's just an improvement patent, you could have some freedom to operate issues. So of course, if you are you know, dependent from a dominant or princeps patent, it's not probably the best way. Maybe you should just license this improvement patent to an already existing company. So this is the kind of you know, factors that we take into account. Yeah, to decide what's the best. Like Anji said, there is not a best way in general. you have to adapt it from each case.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. I think we've drawn to the end of this discussion. I think it's been fascinating. I wish we had more time to talk. We could talk for hours on these topics. But thank you very much for your contribution, and thank you very much to Tony for putting together this event. It's been very memorable and very useful. So thank you all.